In this video, we're going to do a little bit of an introduction to community ecology, or in other words, studying the interactions between just the living parts. So we've already done the ecosystems, which is cycles and climate and things like that, and now we're going to focus on the living interactions. And so recall, a community is, we have a couple different ways of looking at it. So it's a group of interacting populations that are in the same place at the same time. Another way of looking at it is that it's all of the organisms in a place because all of the organisms interact in some degree. So we're going to focus specifically on 5 types of interactions in this lab. And the first of which is called competition. You guys are familiar with competition in sports and just the word in general. In biology, what competition means is that organisms have some sort of resource that's shared, and in particular, that resource is limited. So horses in a great big meadow are not competing for grass because there's plenty of grass to go around. So we're looking for competition only when a resource is shared, that not everybody's going to be able to get what they need successfully. And so when they can't, they compete. There's all kinds of examples of resources that could be competed for. Food, shelter, territory, flowers compete for pollinators, access to water. Within a species, competition for mate. Plants compete for access to sunlight. You certainly don't need to write all of those. Those are just some good examples. Not every organism is going to be successful at getting the resources they need. So the organisms that will be able to compete successfully are those that are going to be well suited for their niche. Remember that a niche is an organism's role in the ecosystem. So it could be that they are well suited for getting sunlight in the place where they are, or it could be that they are well suited for accessing a certain type of food. That characteristic of being well suited is an adaptation. They inherit that characteristic. In addition to having good adaptations, not having competitors or having no predators also gives organisms a leg up. You might be wondering, what kind of species doesn't have competitors or predators? Well, quite frequently an exotic species wouldn't have those. So an exotic species is a species that is not native to a habitat. In other words, it didn't naturally occur there. And because they're not native, oftentimes they don't have a predator that's adapted to eating that kind of prey. And they might have adaptations that the other in the area don't. So because of that, they often outcompete native species that have to deal with those predators. What's notable is that 42% of the species whose populations are threatened or endangered are so because they have to deal with competing with an invasive exotic species. So there's a whole bunch of them, unfortunately. In Wisconsin, we've been just hit really hard by the emerald ash borer. If you've been to Harrington Beach State Park, or really anywhere in Ozaukee County, you've probably seen all kinds of dead trees, and those dead trees are the result of the emerald ash borer. Other ones you've probably heard of are the zebra mussels, the multicolored lady beetle, which are the orange beetles that look like ladybugs, the Asian copes. Those are all things that have just decimated local populations because they have a competitive advantage of not having to deal with predators. Speaking of predators, the predator-prey relationship is another really close community interaction. The predator-prey relationship can be described as predation. A lot of people mispronounce that, so it's predation, like nation, but pred in front of it. And it just describes any interaction where one animal eats the other. The predator, of course, is the animal that's doing the eating, and the prey is the animal that's being eaten. I shouldn't say animal, because prey and predator can apply to organisms eating plants too, or producers. And obviously that's a really important part of an organism's survival. So there's all kinds of adaptations organisms have to either avoid being hunted or to be effective hunters. This is a good point to pause and review. The last 3 types of community interactions are usually classified as one called symbiosis. Symbiosis just refers to an interaction that 2 species have that live in very close contact with one another. And we can classify symbiosis as based on whether the organisms are helped, hurt, or not affected by the interaction. So the first type of symbiosis is called mutualism. That is when both species benefit from that close interaction. If you've seen Finding Nemo, the best example of that is that clownfish Nemo and his dad have to clean the anemone before they leave. They have the advantage of getting protection from the anemone, and the anemone gets the cleaning, although there's some debate about whether the anemone actually needs that. If the anemone doesn't actually need to be cleaned, then that would be an example of commensalism. Commensalism occurs when one species benefits, but the other one's like, meh, whatever, doesn't hurt. So if the clownfish is benefiting from the protection of living in an anemone, and the anemone isn't bothered by it at all, but isn't helped, then that would be considered commensalism. Finally, parasitism is when one species benefits at the expense of the other one. So technically, predation falls under that category. The predator is benefiting at the expense of the prey. The difference with predation and parasitism is that parasitism doesn't usually just involve eating the other one. Parasitism usually lives in or on it, or may eat it, but not eat it completely, so it might eat a portion of it. If you're reading your textbook defines it as the parasite must live in or on the other organism. The idea of living in or on isn't universally accepted, though. When I was in college, my professors did not subscribe to that requirement. Sometimes people describe competition as a type of symbiosis in which both species are harmed by the interaction, and they'd both be better off if there wasn't a competitor. Let's pause for one more review before we call it a day.